security into this process without fundamentally breaking it and against the paradigms of what Agile's trying to do. So here's some ideas, right? So in some places we've already got in here, we can add security into the existing process without fundamentally disrupting it. Certainly, we could develop security stories just like we develop functional stories, and I'll talk more about that later. One of the things we want to suggest early on is you need to think about security at the very, very beginning in terms of at least the high-level categories of security issues you have to figure out. And to do that, we would recommend you do threat modeling, and you might have heard about threat modeling 47 other places, and everyone's saying you got to do it. And we agree that it needs to be done. Of course, not a lot of people talk about how to do it, and I don't have time to cover that in this class. But basically, with threat modeling, you can think about, okay, given the kind of application we're trying to build and where it's going to be deployed and the assets it's protecting and what have you, what are the core risks from a security perspective that this application might face? And then from that, we should be able to come up with some kind of security stories that address those risks. And then we can consider those security stories along with the regular user stories that we're dealing with that are normally generated. Now, again, you're not going to get into heavy detail on the security stories here because you're not ready to implement them. But you want to at least get the high-level ideas on the table so you can prioritize them with all the other things you're trying to do. And then when you get down into the development cycle itself, when you're doing your testing and your development, you should, of course, include security in there as appropriate for that particular cycle. So certainly if you're working on security stories in that cycle, you would work on those. But you should always have some level of security expertise in there as well. One of the things I mentioned on the right is you could introduce a whole sprint just on security. Now, a lot of people would rebel against that. They're like, well, I'm not going to pause for 3 weeks or a month and just do security. Well, as you're trying to prioritize and organize your work, you might decide that it makes more sense to get a whole bunch of security activities and just focus on them during an entire sprint and getting them all done at once because they're all interrelated. Or you might say, you know, I can't afford to pause like that and just do security, so I'm going to interleave it throughout the entire development. Either model could work, and in fact, a combined model might work. So, I mean, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need that security sprint on the right, and I'll talk about some ways of reducing the need for those kinds of sprints. We also think, and this is back with some other guys, like there's one of the chief Agile guys at IBM is talking about, you know, what does it make a secure, what does it indicative of a mature Agile team? And one of the factors that they've indicated was having an independent testing resource for each Agile team is really important because there's a lot of non-functional requirements. And my phone might ring too, so I need to turn mine off. There's a lot of non-functional requirements that developers have to deal with that they're usually not super expert in focusing on or testing. So having an external resource that helps you focus on non-functional requirements, including security, is a significant aid to getting this security done right. Now that external tester, or that extra resource, needs to be a really, really good tester, not just the bottom of the heap tester that didn't make an Agile team because he can't code. He needs to be one of your top 5, 10% kind of testers who's really, really good at that. And maybe that's his job, is to provide that expert level of analysis on a whole bunch of Agile teams so that, you know, he can spread his or her knowledge of, you know, performance and availability and security and whatever else that is across a lot of teams. A natural thing to do, and even in the normal model, is at the end to do a security review. Of course, and we recommend that here clearly, but if you wait to the end to do it all, of course you're going to completely fail. So we still believe it makes sense to have a gating event at the end to do security, which isn't hugely disruptive to Agile because it's not smashed into the middle, but you need to weave some security into the process. Otherwise, that event's not going to be very fun when you have you know, lots and lots of issues that you've dealt with or haven't dealt with during development. So before we get into the actually going through this in detail, I just wanted to talk about some enablers that would strongly encourage towards. Now, you need all this at the very beginning, and in fact, no organization has all this at the very beginning unless they're already relatively mature in terms of software engineering or security engineering. But so you might look at that and go like, well, I don't have that, and I don't have that, and I don't have that. And it's like, okay, that's fine. But I think you should work towards getting this in place. So I think you can actually produce many of these things as you go through your Agile development process, so that after 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 cycles, you start building some of the things. So for example, standard controls. Like you might not have any security standard controls today. Of course, I would hope you have some, but you might not have very many. And so over time, as you build them in projects, you can standardize them, and then the next time you're not reinventing the wheel. And I hope many of you guys heard Jeff Williams talk on the Owasp Enterprise Security, because Owasp is building security components, and standard security components, I think they're actually great for all development paradigms. So, but I think when I think about Agile development, and when I've been working with our customers, those that don't have good standard security components have a much more massive struggle with getting security through their Agile process than those that do. And so, I mean, I actually think that it's just the struggle is sort of inherent, right? Not having standard components is going to make any process more of a struggle. But it's particularly painful in Agile because you're trying to go so fast, right? Secure coding standards. If you had these standard controls, then your secure coding standards could explain to the developers, here's how you use the security components that you have correctly, and here's the coding patterns to deal with common issues that aren't related to standard components, like SQL injection, for example. You might not have a standard component for SQL injection avoidance. You just have a coding paradigm that says thou shalt use parameterized queries or prepared statements or whatever makes sense in your organization. Of course, training is critical, and the Agile guys acknowledge that training for non-functional requirements is key in any Agile team for any kind of non-functional requirement. But it's particularly important for security because security is so difficult. So without training your developers on at least the basics of application security, you're going to have a real hard time producing a secure application regardless of the process that you follow. And finally, ideally you would have expert support, right? Now a lot of organizations don't have any experts, and those that do only have a very small number. And so they can't put those experts in the team. They got to provide them as an external resource that can aid the teams. So, you need, ideally you would have that expertise. If you don't, we understand. But anyway, these are all things that you should strive to get eventually in your organization. You're probably not going to have many of these initially, but I think you can build up to it over time as you make security and Agile a core competency for you. So let's just talk about going through the whole process and what that might be like. So at Sprint Zero, here's where you're trying to think about the functional requirements primarily. Like, what are the big functions that we're going to imagine this application is going to have someday? Well, I think you need to think about, what are the big security requirements that you're going to have someday? So that's where the threat modeling comes in, and the high-level analysis to figure out what your security requirements might be. Now, normally in Agile, you go to the customer and you say, customer, what do you want? And they explain it, and then you document user stories. So you have all these user stories about all the functionality that they want. And if you ask them, well, do you want security? They're either going to go,